Good evening, everyone. And tonight we're going to be talking about the idea of an internal transformation in the Jewish people. You could say in the Israelites, but really at this point we're talking about the Jewish people, in order to allow kind of a final, like the end, the finalized, the return to the land and the redemption, an internal transformation as part of that. As opposed to, let's say, the spilling of the Spirit. So it's a little bit, I guess it's arbitrary in terms that I chose those two things in particular, but you'll understand why I did as we go on. And mainly we're going to be concentrating on a couple of prophetic books, as you shall see. So I'm going to dive right into it. Here we are. Okay. So we're going to start with an example of the idea of what's going to allow the change. Actually, let me stop this for a second. What will allow this? What's the issue? What is the problem here? The problem here is that if you have a framework for history where where Israel sins, and this almost inevitably leads to their exile, right? Even though God did all these things for them and he took them out of Egypt and he gave them the Torah, and they still sinned to such an extent that they lost the land that God gave to them. So the question is, what needs to happen so that, okay, great, you return them to the land, but they'll just do the same thing again. What will make them not do that? Okay, so there is absolutely an idea that among the prophets that they will do teshuvah, they will repent, and they'll be good and everything will be fine. But at the same time, there is a very strong kind of strain that says they're going to need something more. God's going to have to help. Okay, let's actually go back. I think, or let's start with Devarim, with Deuteronomy, because this is where we see this idea. It's not just in our books of the prophets. It's in our, what we call the 5 books of Moses, Torah, right? So we're already going to see that they're particularly in Devarim, and it's Devarim, it's Deuteronomy that Yechezkel is probably drawing from a lot when he talks about the internal transformation that the Jews will go through. And I hear the Jews, the Judeans, once we're talking about Yechezkel, there is no more northern kingdom. And we're talking really about the exiles of Judea. So let's look at Devarim. Okay, so we're reading Deuteronomy 30, Devarim Lamed. All right, and we're talking about after, if we go back chapter, we will see that this is the idea is let me go back more than a chapter actually, right? Is what's going to happen. You have the blessing, you have the what's going to happen, the curse if you do not follow God's commandments, right? And of course, what can end up happening is that you are in fact exiled. And so what is the way back? And the way back here has numerous steps, right, that seem to kind of repeat on themselves. All right. So when these things come to pass, the blessing and the curse, bracha v'klala, right? What's going to happen? Vashivota el livavecha b'chol hagoyim asher hidichacha Hashem Elokecha shama. And so you're going to kind of think again about this when you're among all the nations. In other words, this is after an exile. So you're exiled, and then you're among the nations, and you're going to think about this. And then it says, V'shavta ad Adonai Elohecha v'shamata b'kolo k'chol asher anochi mitzavcha hayom ata uvanecha b'chol levavcha ub'chol nafshecha. You're going to, on your own, repent. You're going to return to God, and you're going to listen to him. All right, and then God's going to return you. It's midah keneged midah, right? God is doing for you what you did for him. You returned, and God will return you. God is going to return you. And have mercy on you. He's going to return and bring you and gather you from all the nations. And note how you've got the root shav 3 times right? Shav, shvut, shav in this verse to show that God is returning to you. What you did for him, you return to God. God's going to return you, and he's going to bring you out from all the nations, right? Right, if you're at the edge of the heavens, God's still going to be able to bring you back, okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to see you were already repenting, but now God's going to make an internal change so that you can listen to God this time. And it says, Umal Adonai Elohecha et levavcha ve'et levav zarecha, la'avat Adonai Elohecha b'chol vavcha u'b'chol nafshecha leman chayecha. And God is going to circumcise your heart and the heart of your children to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your life, so that you should live. All right. So what's the idea is that you're going to repent, but then God's going to make an internal change in you. Now, obviously, heart is not literal. Heart represents, remember that in the ancient world, heart represents both the seat of your feelings and your thoughts. The heart is the mind. This idea that, the brain is where we think, right? That's not, it's the heart's where you think, right? The heart's where you feel, the heart is where you think. Removing the foreskin of the heart means removing all that crap that should be removed in order to be a good Israelite, right? And in order to do that, so God is going to make an internal change, not just for you, but for your children, because the point is it shouldn't happen again. You don't want this to happen again, right? So this is where we see this in Devarim, and we're going to come back to this, and we're going to come back to in certain similarities of language when we come back to Yechezkel. Now, I want to point out here that that this is not particularly deterministic, right? So here we have, first they start with returning to God, and then God makes this change, and then it finishes with I gave before you today life and good and death and evil. In other words, choose life. Right. That's what and that's the idea. The idea is choose life and do good. Now, of course, you say, well, what kind of a choice is that? If bad is death, then it's not much of a choice. It's like you have a choice. You can eat this apple and die, or not eat this apple and live. It's not much of a choice, right? At the same time, it's being set out as a choice, right? You can choose to do this commandment, but because Israel almost inevitably is going to sin and be exiled, right? The solution is, once they repent from their exile, is to make us they can't do it again. And that's going to require a change. Okay, let's now switch to, I'm going to take a pause for some questions. And then what I want to do is talk about what is the point we have, what's the point of why we see certain different approaches to the change that happen to different books, and what they're trying to solve. Susan said, your list of all the things God did for the Israelites, but wasn't enough to help them get fully ready for redemption, reminded me of Dayenu. It did for me also, as I was saying it. Right. I was actually thinking more of Yirmiyahu and what he said in terms of, you got how he kind of conflates leaving Egypt and getting the Torah into one, and then and then after that everything goes bad. And Yechezkel does something a little similar. So I was doing that, but then as I was saying it, yeah, it sounded a lot like Dayenu. Any other comments before we continue? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of dive into this idea of a change which is not particularly internal. It's God, it's being inspired by God, right? So that's the idea of getting God's spirit. And we're going to talk a little bit about the historical context of what we're reading as well. So here we go. Okay, so and excuse me for I'm talking a little bit maybe stridently and fast. I've had a day, so I didn't get a chance to decompress before the class. My apologies, and I just want to teach this, so bear with me. Okay, so here we are. We're in Yeshayahu Mem Daled, Isaiah chapter 44. And as you are familiar, this is what would normally be called in academia, Second Isaiah. Why is it called Second Isaiah? Because it's the part that deals with it's the part that seems to be addressing not Isaiah's original audience, but the returning the exiles during the Persian period who can now return to the land of Israel. Right? There's a real switch. Addresses Cyrus by name. It's so there's a big change, right? So here when we look at if we look at here, let me go in. Where did I want to? What do I want to read? Okay, so right. So what is he says, don't fear my servant Yaakov. What in other words, this is part of your coming back, right? Ki etzok mayim al tzamei v'nozlim hayabasha etzok ruchi al zarecha uvirchati al tzetzaecha. Okay, I'm going to pour water on the thirsty, liquid on the dry land. I will pour my spirit on your children and my blessing on your descendants. V'tzamchu b'ven chatzir ka'aravim al yivlei mayim. Right, they're going to spring up among kind of the grasses like willows on water springs. You know that how willows kind of grow up, grow near any kind of water. If you have a pipe that's leaking, you're going to have something there. So there's just going to kind of spring up. Okay. Now I have to be straight with you guys here. This is not. This doesn't necessarily mean inspiration. It can be read as inspiration. It could just be read as they're going to flourish. Right, they're going to flourish physically. Right. Let's continue to something which is clearer, where God's Spirit is this kind of inspiration, and this is Yoel. So now Yoel is an interesting book. Okay, so I was talking about Yeshayahu and Second Isaiah, that being to the kind of the returning exiles. Yoel is an interesting book because Yoel seems to also be a book that is written after the return to Zion. Why? Yoel has a couple specific things that indicate that time frame. One, Yoel talks about a functioning Beit HaMikdash, a functioning temple, and Yoel remembers an exile. Okay, so because Yoel remembers an exile, and he's talking about a temple that's functioning now, he seems to be speaking after the return to Zion. That seems to be very possibly the case. There is no other indication of date in Yoel, right? You have a name, you don't have an indication of date. All right. So when we read this and we're having after, he's talking about the day of God, right? Kiva Yom Hashem Ki Karov. The day of the Lord is coming because it's close. For Yoel, it's quite a violent time. He actually does a little flip on Isaiah. He says, they're going to turn their plowshares into spears, right? It's a day of war and judgment. But what's going to happen after? And it will be after that I will pour my spirit over all flesh. And all flesh here really means all the Jews or Israelites or whatever, like Bnei Israel. They're not the children of Israel. Your sons and your daughters are going to prophesy, your old people are going to dream dreams, and your young men are going to see visions. Okay. Even on the servants and the maidservants in those days, I'm going to pour my spirit. And I'm going to right? This is where we get it from in the Haggadah. I will show wonders in heaven and earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. This is actually clear. This actually seems to be a reference to war. Remember, I said that his vision of the future is a huge war, right? It's all part of the day of God. So the day of God is this kind of day of wonders, and part of that is pouring the Spirit on the children of Israel, right? And it kind of finishes Adonai Yimalet Kiva Hartzion Uviyushalayim Tiafleta Kasher Amar Adonai Uvasridim Asher Adonai Koreh. Anyone who calls the name of God, they are going to be able to escape from this war. And then you can understand why you have to have this kind of prophecy in the God's Spirit pouring over the young people and the old people, because you need to recognize God in order to escape, right? Possibly that's part of the meaning. And the question is, so why would you have this Spirit pouring? Now, to be honest, you also have this in Yechezkel. It's not, we have this idea as a theme. We can see here I'm reading from Yechezkel, Ezekiel 39:29, Lamed Tet Chaf Tet. V'lo astir od panai mehem asher shafachti et ruchi al Beit Yisrael ne'um Adonai Elohim. I will no longer hide my face from them, because I will have poured my Spirit on over the house of Israel, says God. And these are what this is, and it's part of kind of God's revelation, right? It's the revelation of God acting in kind of the world, and as part of that, pouring his Spirit on the people of Israel, one as part of them kind of recognizing God. Now they're going to have God's Spirit is going to pour over them. They're going to recognize God. Now everything's going to be okay, right? And that's kind of a inspirational. It's not like they need some kind of major change inside them. They're already kind of there, and they're going to get inspired by God. Now, it's true that by bringing these next to each other, I'm kind of smoothing over the differences. Again, like in Yeshayahu, it could be talking about a physical prosperity. In Yoel, it's very much in terms of the context of the day of God, right? Where we have all this kind of weird things happening and tremendous battle. At the same time, there's this idea in this idea of this is what it means. This is going to be at the end. You're going to be inspired by God. You're going to know God by having the Spirit poured on you. Is kind of an optimistic, like, it's not saying you need an internal change. You're not basically evil. You need to be inspired. You need to know God again, right? You need something to bring you close to God, but there doesn't need to be some kind of change, right? Internally, which is going to fix everything. And I think that if we read what I brought from Mishael and Yoel as being kind of already in terms of the context of return to Zion of Shivat Zion, you can understand that. In other words, we're already returning. So there isn't this feeling of we make an internal change, but we need this kind of connection to God. We need to renew the connection to God, as opposed to it's always been inevitable that we would be exiled. How can we possibly make it back, right? Which is a different feeling, as we're going to see, which you have in Yechezkel. We're going to see in the context of why it's so difficult to believe you can make it back, right? Why do we not have it inside ourselves, right, to be able to make it back? Why is it so inevitable, the exile, that and that it needs an internal change? Now, I will remind you, of course, that we just read in Deuteronomy and Devarim, there's also kind of an internal change. We return, and then there's an internal change so that it's not going to happen again. Right? Remember, for your children also, that heart is going to be circumcised. So it's, but it seems like in the context of exile, an exile that we feel now, okay, we're going to see it. You need this kind of internal change, where when we're already returning, it feels like there needs to be this inspiration. Now, I didn't bring it because we've talked about it before. I do want to give the other side of it, right? Which, if you remember, in Zechariah, which is also talking Shivat Zion, is he for inspiration and pouring prophecy on everyone? Anyone remember? He's like, no, prophecy is going to end. People will be ashamed of being prophets. No more prophecy, right? Zechariah seems to be dealing with a lot of false prophecy, and he's like, that's it. Prophecy is going to be over, right? Prophecy is not legitimate anymore. It's going to be over. Right. So there's also that aspect of it, which is in a way a more practical aspect of it. Yeah, you can talk about the Spirit being poured over everyone, but if everyone starts prophesying, you don't know who to trust, right? And we talked about that when we talked in the context of prophecy in the Second Temple period and when it becomes really illegitimate. right? What makes prophecy become illegitimate? Whereas here we're talking kind of metaphorically about God pouring his spirit on. And we can also contrast that with what we've read more than once in Amos. I'll remind you. In Amos, we read, now just to remind you when Amos is speaking way earlier, right? Amos is speaking in the northern kingdom. He's speaking much earlier, and he's possibly our first book prophet. And what he says is, everyone's going to be thirsty. There's going to be, everyone's going to be hungry and thirsty, not for bread and not for water, right? But to hear the words of God, and they won't be able to find the words of God, and they're going to not die, or at least faint from this thirst and hunger that cannot be satisfied, because you guys didn't appreciate it when you had it. You didn't listen to prophecy when you had it, and then when you need it, it won't be there, and you're going to be looking for it and won't be there, right? So Amos is talking at a time of prosperity. Amos is trying to convince people that what they're doing is wrong and that they're going to regret it, right? Whereas what we talked before is right now we're talking about like a return to Zion, where like they need that new connection to God. And now we're going to talk about some people who are dealing with the reality of exile. So I'm going to jump back in because I see no one else is commenting or questioning. So Cheryl, are you saying anything to me, or is yeah?
Miriam, are you making a dichotomy between needing inspiration and God is going to like renew things, or and it's one, and the other is that there's going to be an internal change?
Right, I am making a dichotomy. Now, in certain ways, it's a false dichotomy. I showed you a verse from Ezekiel, which is also talking about pouring spirit on. What I'm looking at is, where do we have kind of this very, more of a strong kind of pouring spirit on as being going to be this big thing, part of the end of days, or an internal change is what's going to typify the end of days? And where is that coming from? Now, obviously, this is an idea, it's my interpretation, right? But what I think is that the idea of what's going to make the end of days special is this pouring of God's spirit on us, is this idea of we're already coming back, and it's not so impossible, but we need to feel divine, we need to feel God's presence in the world, and we need to feel that connection. Whereas what we're going to look at with Ezekiel and mainly Ezekiel, right, to a certain extent Yirmiyahu, is that in the exile, when you've been exiled, you're like, wow, we are so distant and we messed up so badly. How can we make it back, and how can this not happen again? Right? I remember my cousin, she's not so little anymore, but when she was a little girl, she really knew Tanakh very well. She knew Bible very well. And people said, and Midrash and all of that. And people said, why don't you want to study for the Bible quiz, the International Bible Quiz? Why don't you do that? And she's like, no, I don't actually like Tanakh that much. She's like, I know how it ends, and it doesn't end well, right? Because there's this kind of inevitability of moving towards the exile, right? And that's where everything's going. So if that's how you see it, and you're in the exile, how is it not going to happen again? And how do we find our way back? That's a theory I have of why you would need this idea, because it's interesting. And again, we're going to read this because Ezekiel is also known for his emphasis on being able on individual repentance, right? Ezekiel has it really unique in the way he emphasizes how an individual can always repent. And that's what determines what's going to happen to that individual, right? And not having collective punishment. It's the individual, and not having intergenerational punishment. It's the individual and his constant ability to repent. And yet, when he's looking at what's going to happen at the end of days, what's going to need to happen is it's got to be an internal change that God is directly involved in.
Miriam, end of days means something different.
No, I'm using Acharit Hayamim. I'm translating Acharit Hayamim. I don't mean the end of the world. I mean what we call Acharit Hayamim. I mean the Messianic Age. The problem with calling it a Messianic Age is sometimes it doesn't have a Messiah, right? We're used to always saying the Messianic Age with Messiah at the head. Not always when there's a discussion of a Messianic Age, especially actually when you look at prophetic books, the Messiah, remember Messiah means anointed, right? That's what it means, right? Mashiach, it means the anointed one. Who is anointed? The king is anointed. Also, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is anointed, right? Those are two people who are anointed. So when we talk about a Messiah, we're talking about the king, right? Now, yes, prophets in different degrees certainly mention a king or, a head, right? And they're important. Are they leading the whole thing? Not always, and frequently not. You know what I mean? They're not that central in the Messianic age. So I don't like saying Messianic age. You're right that it's hard to say the end time because it's not the end of the world, right? It's not the end of the world. Now we do get, this does become the end of the world in Second Temple texts. In Second Temple texts, they're absolutely Jewish Second Temple texts that describe kind of this day of God and the final judgment of the wicked and the righteous as kind of the end of either an end or the end of the world. There's an end where now the wicked are completely destroyed and the righteous live in this kind of amazing, kind of unnatural world. And we do see that in prophecy, this idea of kind of unnatural world where, the lion lying down with the lamb, that sort of thing. It's an unnatural world that we can look forward to. Or, there's one piece of Enoch, which is very interesting because essentially everyone is dead and the righteous are kind of all in heaven. And they're like, we're cool, we're in heaven, it's fine. And the world is kind of over, right? That level is kind of still unusual in Second Temple texts, but you can find it. Anyway, so but yes.
There must have been tremendous depression in the Second Temple period as we're going into exile again.
So this is interesting because you kind of got me where I live, but when we talk about Second Temple texts, most of them are written. A lot of them are written around the Hasmonean era, right? Al Baumgarten theorized that this is because of the tremendous disappointment in the Hasmoneans, right? That they thought that this was going to be kind of a Messianic age, and it wasn't, right? As somewhat like the disappointment after the 6-Day War. 6-Day War, that's it. It's the end time, right? And we won, and then it's like, no, we're living in reality, and reality is filled with disappointment. And then there's this kind of messianism in all sorts of different ways. It comes out in different ways and is trying to kind of make it the Messianic age. And so he theorizes that there's something similar when the Hasmoneans end up being a disappointment. And you have these books kind of looking forward to a Messianic age. No, this is what's going to happen. And now we can look forward to it. Because there really were Messianic expectations around kind of the Maccabees, hardly a surprise. Then what we have after the destruction, we have two books that really survived that were written after the destruction. There was the Second Temple's destruction. They were responding to the Second Temple's destruction. Second Baruch, right? And Fourth Ezra. And those books are trying to deal with the horror of the destruction and the tremendous unfairness, because what they're like, Fourth Ezra is like saying, okay, we were terrible, but are we worse than the Romans? Like, really? Like, weren't they worse? As bad as we were, weren't they worse? And they won, they're doing great, right? So it's interesting because Fourth Ezra what Fourth Ezra does is it takes Ezra as a character who in the book lives through the destruction of the First Temple, which is a little weird, but chronologically, but that's what it is in the book. Ezra lives through the destruction of the First Temple. He's reacting to the destruction of the First Temple, but we know the author is actually reacting to the destruction of the Second Temple, right? And so that's what's going on there. And there we see that one of the things that they talk about for the first time, we see it prominently, is this idea that there's sin from Adam. Either from Adam or from Adam's sin, we have this idea of the evil heart that Adam has kind of bequeathed to all his descendants, and that the law that getting the Torah wasn't enough to combat, right? And that seems to be kind of an explanation for this cataclysmic catastrophe that happens to the Jews, because how can you explain this cataclysmic catastrophe just based on what we did, right? Because even if we were bad, weren't they worse, right? So it's interesting. That kind of takes us to a whole different level. So let's go back now and talk about.
Miriam?
Yes.
Who's the author you quoted as drawing a parallel between the disappointment in the Hasmoneans and our current situation?
Al Baumgarten. Yeah, he's great. Everything he writes is terrific. Yeah, I'm a big fan of his. He's also a really nice guy. So, and his daughter Dav is in our show. So, anyway, okay. So let's dive into Yechezkel. No, this way. Let's do that. Okay. All right. So let's go into. I'm going into two parallel. Well, actually, let's start with Yirmiyahu because we have a couple of short references to this idea of maybe of God like giving us a heart to understand. It's not nearly where Yechezkel takes it, right? It's kind of I'm bringing it as a bit of a parallel, but it's not. It doesn't go quite as far, right? But it is the same idea, right? So here I'm reading Jeremiah chapter 24, Yirmiyahu Chaf Daled, right? I'm reading from Pasuk Hey, verse 5. So God says, Kateinim atavot ha'ele, just like these good figs, ken akir et galut Yehuda asher shilachti min hamakom hazeh eretz kasdim l'tova. So I will remember the exile of Yehuda that I sent out from this place to Babylon, right, for good. What does that mean? That there's some good figs among bad figs. The idea is I'll remember they're good figs, so I'm going to bring them back, right? V'samti eini alehem letova v'shimotim al haaretz hazot uvnitim v'lo eheros unatatim v'lo etosh. So I'm gonna remember them for good. I'm going to bring them back to this land. I'm going to build them up, and I won't destroy. And I'm going to plant them, and I will not pull them out, which kind of contradict. It's meant to be directly contrasting with previous prophecies of destruction. V'natati lahem lev ladat oti, ki ani Adonai v'ayuli la'am v'nochi ehyeh lahem le'elohim, ki yeshuvu elai b'chol libam. And I'm going to give them a heart to know me, because I am God. And they are going to be my nation, and I will be their God, because they will return to me with all their heart. So here we have this idea of I'm going to bring them back to the land, then I'm going to give them a heart that's going to allow them to know me, and then they're going to be able to return to me with their whole heart. We see a similar idea in Yirmiyahu Lamed Bet, Jeremiah 32. Again, it's I'll read from verse 38. Lamchet, vayuli la'am vani ehyeh lahem le'elohim. They're going to be my nation, and I will be their God. V'natati lahem lev echad v'derech echad lirauti kol hayamim letov lahem v'livneihem achareihem. I'm going to give them one heart and one way, one path to fear me all the days, so that it will be good for them and to their children after them. Right. Now, this is also very similar to Devarim, right? The idea that I'm going to circumcise their hearts so that they can keep my laws. They'll do, and it's for them and for their children, right? So that this is not going to happen again. And then I'm going to create a new covenant with them, right? V'charati lehem brit olam. I will create an eternal covenant, right? Because again, they're not going to. They have a new heart, right? And they're not going to go back on it. And again, remember, heart is really heart and mind. So let's go into the more kind of, in a way, extreme, but again, even more parallel in a way to Devarim, to Deuteronomy. So if we look at Yechezkel Yudalef, and here we're really going to see the context of why it seems so necessary to have an internal change, okay? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of context without reading it inside so that we have enough time to talk about this. So the idea is that Yechezkel, as is his wont, has been kind of brought up, and he's been seeing what's going on in the city of Jerusalem, and it's bad stuff, right? People are doing evil things in the city, right? And so they're going to die. right? There's going to be war. There's going to be a sword fighting in the city, and they are going to die. All right. So in the midst of this kind of vision, right? God says, and apparently this is, and I've talked about this before. I just want to remind you, what reality is Yechezkel talking? Actually, I'm going to stop the share for a second so I can just talk to you guys. What reality is Yechezkel dealing with? Yechezkel is dealing with a reality where you have an initial exile, right? Remember, I've said this before, but it really bears repeating. You've got Jews in Jerusalem. There are still Jews in Jerusalem, or Jews who have not been exiled, right? That's where Yirmiyahu is. That's where Jeremiah is, right? Yechezkel has been exiled with the better class of people from Jerusalem, right? So he's in Bavel, he's in Babylonia with a bunch of people who don't know if they're still part of the history of the Jewish people, because they've been exiled and there are still Jews in Jerusalem. So does that mean that they get lost, like the Jews of the northern kingdom, like the Israelites of the northern kingdom? Are they just going to be gone? Are they not part of the nation anymore? Do they not have a future? What's the story? What's going on? And in fact, we see in this chapter that they're not the only ones wondering this. The people who are still in Jerusalem are supposedly saying, hey, you guys were exiled because we're great. We get your stuff, right? We're the ones who are supposed to inherit. You guys are gone, right? So if we take a look at what we're saying here, okay. Ben Adam. Achecha anshe gulatecha, your brethren, the people of your redeemers. In other words, it's talking in phrases of inheritance, right? When you have, if you you have a field and someone has to redeem the field, it's your closest relative who redeems the field. Your brethren, the people who would redeem your field, v'chol beit Yisrael kulo, and all the house of Israel. Usually when Yechezkel says house of Israel, it means the Judeans, okay? The whole house of Israel. Asher amru lahem yoshvei Yerushalayim rachaku me'al Adonai lanu hi nitna ha'aretz l'morasha. That the inhabitants of Jerusalem said, they have been distanced from God. The land has been given to us as an inheritance. So it's very clear the people who stayed in Jerusalem have interpreted this, and you would totally understand why. They're like, hey, God rejected them, and God has chosen us. We're the ones who still have a future in the land of Israel. They're gone. That's it. They're over, right? Lachen emor ko amar Adonai Elohim ki yerchaktim bagoyim v'chi hafisotim ba'aratzot v'hi lehem lemikdash ma'at ba'aratzot asher ba'u sham. Says, even though, God says, even though you have been distanced among the nations and spread out among the lands, I will be for you for a small, it's not clear, is it a small temple, or I'm still connected to you. I'm still there for you. I'm connected to you in on the lands that you come to. Okay. So you're still, I'm your little temple. God is connected to you. Okay. Lachen emor. Now here's the prediction of the return. Lachen emor ko amar Adonai Elohim b'ki avatzti etchem min hamim v'asafti etchem min haratzot asher nefotzatem bam behem v'natati lachem et admat Yisrael. And so God says, I'm going to gather you from among the nations. I'll gather you out from the lands that you have been scattered among, and I will put you on the land of Israel. Now, and your job, you guys, I am using Ramon here, Ramon's interpretation for this, but I think he's right on the mark. Your job is to, you're going to come and you're going to get rid of all this idol worship, because that's one of the things that Yechezkel was seeing in his visions was the idol worship, and they're still doing it. These people in Jerusalem, they're still doing this stuff. You're going to come back and you're going to remove all the idol worship. Okay. V'natati lehem lev echad v'ruach chadasha eten b'kirbachem v'asiroti lev ha'evan mibsaram v'natati lehem lev basar. And I will give them one heart, and it will give you and in Septuagint, it's lev acher, a different heart, right? Which works with ruach hadashah, new spirit, right? So it's either I'll give everyone a one heart that they'll all be in the same mind, or in the Septuagint, it's a different heart, like a new spirit, and I'll put a new spirit inside them. Vasiroti lev ha'evan mibsaram. I'm going to remove the heart of stone. Now, this is an unusual image, and it's not coming from anywhere else. This is just Yechezkel. You have the image of a heart of stone. The heart of stone is probably the stubbornness, right? They're stubborn. They're not listening to God. I'm going to remove that heart. I'm going to give you a heart. I'm going to give you a heart of flesh, right? So it's a natural thing, right? It's what you should have had, right? But I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to follow my commandments. It says, "L'man b'chukotai yelechu," so that they follow my commandment, my laws. "Vet mishpatai yishmeru v'asuotam," and they'll keep my commandments and do them. "Vayuli la'am v'ani ayeh lehem Elohim," and they will be my nation, and I will be their God. Right? So again, this is this idea of, in order for this to happen, so they follow my laws, that I have to make an internal change. Again, it's a metaphorical internal change, but it's an internal change. People, they need to change. Why do they need to change? Because you're talking to a group of, they're exiled already. How can we get back? We're not getting back tomorrow. That's already clear. It's not happening in the next 5 years. How can we get back? There's some background noise, guys. So if you haven't muted yourself, please mute yourself. How can we get back? And how can we stay in the land of Israel? If it's gotten this bad, that there's idol worship in the temple precincts, how can we get back? And the answer is, God's going to make an internal change. He's going to make it so you're internally changed. And this little interval actually ends with a description of God leaving the temple. In other words, in case you didn't understand that you guys, the exiles, are the good guys, I will now describe how God, after showing me this, discussing this, is actually leaving the temple in Jerusalem. So he's not there anymore, because they've screwed up so badly. So that kind of, it's giving the exiles that are with Yechezkel hope and a belief in themselves as having the future history of returning, right? They have a job, right? And they have this future. And even though they think, well, what's going to keep us in the land of Israel? What's going to keep us from sinning again? God himself is going to make an internal change, right? We see a similar thing in, it's a very parallel passage in Ezekiel 36 and Yechezkel Lamed Vav.
Miriam,
Yes.
if I can just note that this verse, "V'kibatzti etchem min ha'aratzot," it appears like in the heart of Yitzhak ben Tzvi. Yitzhak ben Tzvi, he was the president in the 50s, and one of his biggest projects was to relate to all the different groups, to the Kurds, to the Yemenites. He used to host them in his hut, and it's like a big verse written in large letters in his hut.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, and he also was very good to the Shomronim. The Shomronim celebrate his birthday. I think they celebrate it as like a holiday because he was very good to them.
Yeah.
Here, if we look at again, and here again, we see this parallel of, because you have really kind of gone far beyond desecration. God, I'm going to need to get involved in order to make it even possible for you to come back. Okay. So here it says, I'm reading from, I'm reading Yechezkel Lamed Vav, Ezekiel 36. I'm reading from verse Chaf Bet, verse 22. L'chen emor lebeit Yisrael, Ko amar Adonai Elohim, lo lemanchem ani oseh beit Yisrael, ki im l'shem kodshi asher chilaltem b'goyim asher batem sham. I am not returning you because you've repented, right? What I'm doing is I'm doing it for my own name, right? Because you have desecrated my name among the nations. And in order to sanctify my name, I'm going to show them that I can bring my people back to the land of Israel, right? In other words, why am I doing this? I'm sanctifying my name among these nations that you desecrated my name among. I'm going to show them that I'm God, right? And that I'm going to do that by gathering you in. Now, again, this shows a kind of, well, you guys all suck, right? I'm not gonna Cheskel's like, not gonna lie. You guys are not great, right? So how are you gonna get back, right? How are you gonna get back? God's gonna do it for his own name. Now, the truth is, again, if we go back to Devarim, if we go back to Deuteronomy, right, the song of Hazinu, that is why God brings them back in Hazinu. In Hazinu, if you read Hazinu carefully, the reason that God returns Israel to their land is for his own reputation among the nations, right? That's the reason, period, right? So this connects very much. They used to say that Yechezkel draws a lot from Leviticus, from Vayikra. And now, I mean, I think not just recently, right, but for a long time, they've recognized how much Yechezkel uses Devarim, uses Deuteronomy, right, and relies on that for a lot of what he does, right? So, and here we see an example of that. That why is God going to bring us back? Because it's for his own sake. It's for his own sake. And again, you have to be pretty negative and really hopeless to see this. And Yechezkel has all sorts of places where he shows just how hopeless the people feel. The dry bones, of course, is a classic one. We will eventually do the dry bones again because I love teaching that. But it's this kind of hopelessness that he's speaking to is it's kind of a cure for it, is saying, listen, guys, God is just going to bring you back. He's going to bring you back, and he's going to make it possible for it not to happen again by giving you a new heart. And here we see before the heart, right? And I'm going to throw pure water on you, and you will be purified. I'm going to purify you from all your impurities and essentially idols. ונתתי לכם לב חדש ורוח חדשה אתן בקרבכם והסירותי את לב האבן מבשרכם ונתתי לכם לב בשר. I'm going to give you a new heart and a new spirit, and I'm going to remove the heart of stone and again give you a heart of flesh. Same as we read before. ואת רוחי אתן בקרבכם. And note the difference of pouring my spirit on you and putting my spirit within you. Right? I'm going to put my spirit within you. Vasiti et asher b'chukai telechu, vasiti et asher b'chukai telechu, u'mishpatai tishmeru vasitem. And I'm going to do that so you keep my laws. Right? Vishavtem ba'aretz asher natati lavotechem, and you'll dwell in the land I gave to your fathers. Now you're going to be able to keep the laws. You're going to be able to keep dwelling in the land. And you will be my nation, and I will be your God, right? And then it goes on and says, I will save you from all your impurities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it finishes, right? I'm not doing this for you, right? God is doing it for himself. So once again, why in this, as opposed to what we read like before in Yoel and Yeshayahu, where it's pouring the spirit on as part of the day of God, as part of the wonders. Here what we have is, in order for you to be able to return, in order for you to be able to keep my laws and not be thrown out again, God am going to make a change inside you. And I think this is a theory. I think that this is talking to the hopelessness of the people, that Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel are dealing with exiles, either people right before exile, which is what Yirmiyahu is dealing with more, and Yechezkel is dealing with people right after an exile, and they are hopeless, and they're looking around and they're like, we're so bad that we're going to get thrown out of our land. So how do we, even if God brings us back, how do we stay in the land? And the answer is, don't worry, God's going to make a change inside you so that now you will be able to keep the law. And then he'll have the new covenant, right? You'll have a forever covenant. I'm going to pause and I'm going to do one small thing to end. So Donnie and Libby ask, was the idea of the new heart ever linked to the reduction in the appeal of idolatry in the later Second Temple period and beyond? Well, I have to go back to the Gemara and see if it quotes that in any sense when it's talking about the end of the evil inclination of the Yetzer Hara for idolatry, because of course that's a big theme in the Gemara, that this desire for idolatry was at some point so unbelievably hard to resist, and then it just kind of died, right? And that there was kind of a deal that was made in order for that to happen. I have to go, this is a good question. I have to go back to the Gemara and see if the verse is quoted in that context. There is this idea, it does take us to that connection of what becomes kind of known, like immediately post Second Temple literature as the evil heart, is what we would call the evil inclination, right? And then there's this idea of, to what extent can you talk about the evil inclination as something apart from the person? That's something that really happens in the Gemara, where it starts talking about the evil inclination as something that's also almost a demon. It's almost demonic, right? So you can say, oh, the evil inclination, I'll drag the evil inclination to the Beit HaMidrash. That's how I'm going to beat it, right? Whereas if you read in the Torah and in the Bible in general, an inclination is part of a person. It's not something that you can kind of point to. But in these verses, you can kind of point to it. You can circumcise your heart, right? You know, you can, or God can circumcise your heart. God can remove your heart of stone. And that's kind of a step on the way to saying, seeing this evil inclination as something separate. Like, just remove it, fight it, beat it, right? And then that becomes, that gets combined with this belief in demons that kind of grows during the Second Temple period, probably at least partially as a result of the mix in with Persian culture, right? Where you have some people saying, oh, why do I sin? Because there are demons that are like influencing and making people sin. And that idea combined with another very strong belief in the Second Temple period of the evil inclination making me sin. And then you get in the Gemara this kind of combination of evil inclination demon, where the evil inclination is like, right, a demon. And then you can talk about it as if it's completely external to you and do these things to beat it, right? Yes, Cheryl. You're on mute.
Is the heart of stone what led you to sin in the first place and while you're exiled, or is the heart of stone what happens to you once the exile has happened?
No, I think it's supposed to be what caused you to be stubborn. Like it caused that stubbornness. And I didn't bring all the places where it says, you walked in the Shrirut Libcha, right? It's stubbornness of your heart. I think you see that more in Yirmiyahu than Yechezkel, but I don't want to just promise that, but you have that as a phrase. It's a very common phrase. And it's pretty clear that heart of stone is what made you sin to begin with. So yeah, so that's been kind of all along.
It's not into the exile.
No, because the whole point is that the exile is your fault. So why was the exile it was your fault? Because you sinned. Why did you sin? What's going to keep you from sinning again, right? You were sinned because you went in the stubbornness of your heart, right? Again, not seeing it necessarily as separate from you. You went in your own stubbornness and you sinned. So what's going to stop you from doing that again when you're brought back to the land? And the answer is, when the audience, right, is at their lowest, the promise is, no, God's going to come in and he's going to fix it so that you could do it, right? And I did want to kind of end with, if we just read the Haftarah from Malachi, and it's a completely different idea. Vashiv liv avot al banim v'banim al avotam. He says Eliyahu is going to come. Eliyahu the prophet is going to come, and he's going to reconcile the heart of the fathers with the sons and the sons with the fathers. And this is actually a very interesting thing because it connects to, if I'm going to talk about Malachi, if you remember, is from Shivat Zion, is from Return to Zion. He's later than the other prophets of Return to Zion because he's already got a functioning Beit HaMikdash. And what's interesting is he's talking about the reconciling of generations, right? The generations are disagreeing with each other. We see that very much in, if we talk about Second Temple literature. So in First Enoch, there's this idea of, you have like the lambs have their eyes open and the sheep are blind, right? The parents are just doing the wrong thing, and the kids know the right way. They know how to listen to God. And it seems like this is the situation that Malachi is talking about. This is a situation we have in pretty much every generation, right? Where the kids know better and the parents know better. And the idea is, let's get them all on the same page and they're all going to serve God kind of together in the same way, instead of constantly arguing about what the better way to go is. So
regarding this heart of stone, it's interesting that in the Egyptian belief, when a person dies, there is a creature that weighs his heart, and if it's too heavy, he goes to hell.
Yeah, but it's got to be lighter than a feather. They weigh it against the feather of Ma'at.
You can actually see this
lighter than that. Yeah.
In Museum of Mikra, you can actually see a painting of it, painting they took from Egypt, when you see someone weighing the heart of the dead person.
Yeah. So that's the so it's an interesting idea, like how much is it drawing from that? Actually, it's interesting to wonder, because there is a lot of Egyptian culture kind of makes it into Babylonian culture also, because Egypt is very influential, and Yechezkel very much reacts to Babylonian culture. So I wonder, if that's also coming from there. Even though I don't think they talk about a stone heart with Egypt. I think it's just the heaviness of the heart, right? Yeah,
but we have it also in Shmot, v'chabadati et lev paro, which probably relates to that. The Bible probably knew this Egyptian belief, so they said,
yes, right. That we translate as hardened the heart of Paro could be I made his heart heavy, right?
So it's that translation, because in Hebrew relates much better to this belief,
right. And then what it is it's that stubbornness also, right? It works well because you're talking about a heart of stone, and that the idea of stubbornness. What I did was I made it heavy, namely stubborn, right? So that's a nice idea. Thanks, Ido.
But Miriam,
yes.
Is Yechezkel trying to make a connection between a heart of stone and gods of stone, between a heart of stone and idolatry? Do you see that?
I don't think so, because he doesn't say it. Like if he used, it would be very easy for him to kind of use. He does talk about removing the idols from on your heart. He does talk about that elsewhere. So, but I think in this case, he's not necessarily thinking of idols of stone, because there's also this whole idea that they make idols of wood, and isn't that ridiculous? Half of it they use to cook their food, and half of it they worship, right? They talk about idols of wood a lot. So I think he doesn't. I can look at it, but I don't think that he's thinking of idols here, idols made of stone. But you're right that he does talk about kind of removing the idols from your heart. It's an idea. Like I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it could go either way.
Just one more very general observation. Yes. I sense here a very subtle machloket between the various prophets with regard to the ultimate end game. Universalistic virtue.
It's not so subtle. It's not so subtle. You have, like I said, Yoel actually takes Isaiah's prophecy and flips it. Like, we'll have to do that. We'll do that in one class. We'll look at what Isaiah and Yoel. It's not so subtle, right? They're very different ideas. There are different ideas of what the day of God means. Is it good, right? Amos says, why do you want the day of God, right? It's darkness and not light. You guys are all going to die in the day of the Lord that you're waiting for, because it probably everyone's bored and they're like, oh, it'll be so exciting, and Amos is like, no, this is bad news, right? So they absolutely have different visions of what a good, and like, so for example, Amos does not like the day of the Lord, and he prophesies this beautiful what's the end, what's the final age, or this final age, what's the future age? It's of amazing natural bounty, just natural bounty. That's what you want. That's what we're aspiring to, right? Whereas Yoel is talking about, blood and fire and pillars of smoke, right? And that's good. That's cool. That's wonders from God, right? So there's absolutely very different visions about what kind of what do you want, right? Which is, it's a little bit strange. Like, why should we be looking forward to a time of war? And in the ancient world, like, it's easy for me, like, of course now we see war, but not, it's like, I'm not living in Ukraine, right? So I don't see it in front of me, but in the ancient world, people saw it in front of them all the time, right? So to say, yeah, yay, there's going to be this big war, like, it's a little weird. I mean, I do think that once you're living in an age of empire, you're probably not seeing the same sort of war that you were before, so that you could kind of romanticize it a little bit more.
But I think the bottom line is the debate is the ultimate goal the redemption of Israel, or is it the redemption of the entire world?
Oh, that's a different question. Okay, so I didn't realize that's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yes. And then what does the redemption of the entire world look like? Right. And it's interesting because, for example, and so that's like, are we talking about, are we using terms that seem to indicate a new creation, but all we really care about is the Jewish people? Or are we really speaking about everyone? Right. So you have different things there also, right? Or like when Micha says, oh yeah, we're going to go follow our God, maybe all the other nations will follow their gods, and it's going to be this beautiful future. Like what? Right? What is that? What kind of future is that? Like, what is that supposed to mean? Like, does that mean we don't care about the other God? Like, what does that mean? Right? So all of these things are different. And maybe so maybe I'll do. I have to think about how to split it. Maybe I could do a class on that, like universal versus, particularistic. But of course, most of them are particularistic. Most of them are going to just care about the Jewish people. And even like, for example, Ezekiel, who talks about how does God govern the entire world? And he uses examples that show he's talking about non-Jews. He's like, if you had Eov and Daniel and who's the third one? Now I forgot. Eov, Daniel, and Noah, right? Were all like non-Jews, right? Daniel, not Daniel. We fix it to Daniel, but it's Daniel, right? All famously righteous non-Jews, right? And they were in a city, a place that deserved destruction. They would not save that place, right? And so he wants to say, this is how God governs the world. Forget you guys. God governs the world with an individual looking at what individuals deserve, right? And the idea seems to be that God cares about the righteous Gentiles, right? That God is saying, but when Ezekiel's talking about the future, he doesn't really care about the Gentiles, right? When he's talking about the future age, he cares about the Jews. So you're always, that the universalistic thing is always going to be kind of an interesting minority, right? Of these predictions. Anyway, so I see I'm already losing people. Thank you everyone for joining me, and I will see you. I will see you not next week, because next week's Pesach. I will be in touch regarding what our next class is. Okay.
Let me just add one last comment.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach, everyone.
Miriam,
Yes.
is the last class on, can you listen to it again, the last class that we did last week?
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube.
Okay. You have a link to YouTube?
I emailed it to everyone.
Okay, I'll look for
I
it.
emailed it to everyone, and you can also just look up the channel and you'll find it. It's Miriam Brand with Miriam Miriam. You see how I spell my name. So
Miriam, I think Libby just had one last question.
Yes, Libby.
Oh, I'm a little confused. These prophecies, I thought that they were primarily about the end of the first Galut and the return for Shivat Zion, but they also seem to be about the end of days or the Messianic era or whatever.
It's going to be. I mean, that's what everyone always thinks at the end of days is like. It's the same way, it is about the end of days, right? And they're talking about the return to Zion, right? That's supposed to be it, right?
But that happened, and then the end of days didn't happen. So the prophecies sort of stick around, and they get applied.
Right. You just say, oh, it's later. It's going to happen later, right? And for what? Or like in Ezra and Nehemiah, they're like, yeah, it did happen. This is it. This is the prophecy. This land, living in Yehud as a province of the Persian Empire, this is God giving us what he promised, right? That's Ezra and Nehemiah, right? So you have people who are saying that. This is it. This is it. The same way when I read Zechariah and I'm like, yeah, young babies and old people in the streets of Jerusalem, right? What am I doing when I do that, right? And I'm saying that this is that time. This is the time prophesied. So you have that. I'm fairly certain you have that mix, but of course, the natural thing is to say, okay, it's going to be, in the future. The same way that you have, excuse me, I go back to Second Temple literature. So the Book of Jubilees it seems to be working towards seeing Judah Maccabee and that the Maccabean Wars as being the entrance into a Messianic age, right? But it's not. So then they just keep copying the book, and they're like, no, the Messianic age is coming.
Mhm.
So,
But the people who saw it as happening during Shivat Zion would have needed to feel like they all had their hearts had been transformed.
well, I mean, it depends who they're reading more, right? And you could say their heart. Look, honestly, I've said this before, and anyone who needs to leave, of course, you can leave. But what's described, at least in terms of Ezra reading the Torah, where they're like, okay, Ezra, it's time to read the Torah. Here, look, we've set up a shtender for you, right? Like, they're asking him to read the Torah. He doesn't come and say, I'm going to read the Torah. They've got it all set up. And when they find out it's like Rosh Hashanah, they didn't know, they start crying. So, like, if you like, assuming that you say, okay, that's what happened, like that, you could absolutely say that and say, wow, here we are in this age where it's all changed. It's different. And especially if you say, well, look, there used to be this idol worship in the temple, and now, no. Like, later on, again, that you have that problem, right? But like, yeah, there's lots of ways to interpret it. I mean, it is already metaphorical. So, why not?
Okay.
So on that happy note, happy Pesach, everyone.
Happy Pesach. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thanks for joining me.
Miriam.
Bye-bye.